So, hello everyone, I'm Marvin.
I'm Ashley.
Emulating.
I'm Emily.
For our book club assignment, we read Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. This book is a story of Trevor Noah's life growing up as a mixed child during an apartheid. Apartheid affected Trevor particularly because he was born from a black South African mother and a Swiss white father. His book is broken up into three main parts. Each takes place through a separate part of Trevor's life. So I'll be going over part one, and so part one of Born a Crime with begins with some context of how Trevor Noah grew up and the environment of that. For those who don't know, he was born in Johannesburg, South Africa, and was raised in a quote black township known as Soweto. He grew up during a very recent period of South African history where an apartheid policy was in place. This allowed for systemic racism legally. Through this and the 1927 Immorality Act, made it legal for any sexual or romantic relation between an African native and a European completely illegal and punishable by prison, and in many cases even death. As such, this created an environment that discriminated against anyone of black or colored backgrounds. Trevor Noah himself was known as colored due to his father being European, and this is a major plot point of the book. Both in and out of the home, Trevor was treated as a rare item. His family, other than his mother, did not know how to reprimand him. In school, he felt out of place, and in life, he just knew he was different. He was raised in an African household, but was considered colored, and as such struggled with the identity of it. However, Trevor actually said he wasn't above using it to his advantage. When he was young, because he could use his ability to speak multiple language and mixed heritage to avoid dangerous situations such as causing trouble for his family and not getting beaten as a result. Though upon entering middle school, in the beginning of his adolescence, Trevor was met with a choice: continue taking advantage of his mixed heritage or identify with his black upbringing, which in South Africa meant being a native. He chose to connect with his heritage, which put him on his path to civil rights awareness that lasts to this day. Now, my teammate Elaine will go for part.
Part two. Part two is focused on Trevor's romantic life as he transitions into adolescence. His mother has always tried to give him advice about women and speak frankly to him about the love and sex. When Trevor is 12, he has just started at the new school where Valentine's Day is taken really seriously. In grade 8, Trevor starts middle school at Sandringham, a huge school that is racially and economically diverse. Trevor has experienced intense poverty growing up with his mother and has become more self-conscious about income over time. He doesn't fit in with the white kids because of his lack of money, and while he feels most comfortable with the poor black students, but they live in faraway neighborhoods so he can't socialize with them outside of school. At lunchtime, the students rush to line up to buy food. Meanwhile, Trevor begins taking orders from wealthy white students and taking a cut in exchange for standing in line to get their food for them. Although he still feels isolated and lonely, he now has a function within the social hierarchy of the school.
The third part starts out with Trevor telling the story of a boy he knew named Hitler. While we all know that naming a kid named Hitler is a big no-no, Trevor explains the significance of the name, that because so many Africans were systemically deprived of education or given very poor education due to apartheid, some South Africans during that time did not get the opportunity to even study World War II or history in general. However, what we do know, or what they did know, that there was a white man named Hitler who was so powerful that it made the white man ask the black man for help to fight against him. And if there's a guy this badass, then he must have been a very powerful man. This illustrates the difference in education between classes and requires empathy from the readers to fully comprehend. A big theme of the third half of this book is Trevor defining what the hood was to him. And while there are multiple black townships mentioned in the book, Alexandra, or Alex as it's referred to, stands out as the real hood according to Trevor. And When Trevor and his friends were arrested in a minibus while coming back from a dance competition, the police officer who questioned them told him that he, quote unquote, doesn't belong with the hood people because he's from what is considered a better town and because of his lighter skin color. This led to the realization that while his friends idolized the quote unquote hood life, that it's the only life to them, while he himself had options, which refers to the metaphor of teach a man to fish and they can feed themselves, but you still need to give them the proper tools. Trevor gets put in jail, and initially he actually wasn't scared of it. He actually enjoyed being in jail because they fed him decent food and it meant having a roof over the top of his head as he slept. He was actually more scared of getting yelled at or beaten by his mom and his stepfather, so he stuck it out in jail for about a week. During his brief time in jail, Trevor uses his skills of languages to bond with a fellow cellmate. And the final but lengthy chapter of this book talks about Trevor and his family's experience with Abel, who was his stepfather. Abel physically abuses Trevor's mom after he moves out as an adult. And after his mom breaks up with him and moves out, Abel actually tracks her down and shoots her in the face. She miraculously survives in what can only be described as an act of God.
There are also small one-page blurbs in the beginning of each chapter throughout the book that mostly talk about apartheid and its history. He states in one of the blurbs that Black South Africans outnumbered white South Africans nearly 5-1. Yet apartheid was convincing people who were the overwhelming majority to turn on each other. Trevor explains that in order to successfully implement apartheid in South Africa, they first had to divide the Black people. Physical division came when they divided the neighborhoods based on race, but deeper division came with the language barriers due to South Africa having 11 official languages. He also talks about the effect apartheid had on the education Black South Africans would receive versus the education white South Africans would receive. He states that Bantu schools taught no science, no history, no civics, only metrics and agriculture. Most of the blurbs were to highlight how apartheid made absolutely no sense. The Chinese were considered part of the black race, yet the Japanese were considered white. The colored race materialized, having their way with the Khoisan women when settling in Cape Town. The Immorality Act of 1927 prohibited intercourse between Europeans and natives. In order to sum up his views of apartheid with the use of powerful rhetoric, Trevor states that plainly, apartheid was a police state, a system of surveillance and laws designed to keep Black people under total control. Throughout the book, he illustrates this viewpoint through the stories he tells from his childhood and how they impacted who he is today. Ashley, how did the book club experience aid in your understanding of the use of rhetoric in describing identity and communicating that to an audience?
For myself personally, I feel like this book club experience helped show me that while identity is something that's complex and absolutely something that cannot be summarized quickly in a sentence or even a paragraph, it is definitely worth taking the time to read about the experiences of others. And up until extremely recently, I've never been a fan of reading biographies because I just assumed they were boring. But the most valuable thing I learned from my extremely limited experience reading them is that it allows you to have more empathy for others and allow others to share their experiences. I actually first read Born a Crime about 2-3 years ago, and it was one of the first books that showed me that the books with the use of effective rhetoric to describe one's identity were equally powerful as the greatest fiction books, because it's even more spectacular that this is something that actually happened. You know, and Marvin, how do you feel Trevor uses identity and rhetoric in his book? And do you think the rhetoric was effective?
I was actually really shocked by the way Trevor Noah worded his book. One of the most powerful things he brings up is the power of language and how speaking and sounding like another can change all of their perceptions. For example, Trevor, as a child, was able to speak 7 languages well enough to communicate in just about any way he needed and with anyone he really needed to. We've all experienced moments in restaurants, stores, during travel, or maybe in school where people had different accent or spoke a whole nother language altogether and probably felt out. You guys ever have anything like that?
Actually, I did a little bit back. Sorry, I'm Chinese, but my family's from Malaysia, and Malaysia is kind of one of those places where the big 3 biggest ethnicities is Chinese, Indian, and native Malaysian people. And people always came up to me assuming that I spoke Mandarin Chinese, and I didn't, which really sucked. but I spoke Malay, which kind of created I don't know how to describe it, some kind of like conflict within people's head. Like, why do you look like this, but you don't speak the language you are supposed to? And I think I kind of saw that, especially I think when Trevor spoke to a man who spoke his stepfather's language. I forgot what that's called. But people always looked at him in the book and said, "Hey, you look like this. Why do you speak like this?" And that's definitely something I felt before.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the exact thing that Trevor Noah covers. And he even says that language is arguably more powerful than skin color, race, gender, or other like physically notable traits. Trevor used his own versatility of being able to speak 7 different languages, and I believe it's now 11 or something like that. It's quite a few fluently. And he used to be able to go, and he still does go to different groups. And in many cases, back then he even used them to save him from dangers of to quote him, of those who were different or those who thought they were different from him. Like one such example is he was about to get mugged, and he understood the language they were speaking behind him. And instead of like saying "leave me alone" in their native tongue, he actually turned around and said, "Hey, let's mug somebody too." And they were surprised because he looked as if he should be speaking English, Dutch, or I don't know how to pronounce it properly, but another one of the native African languages. But he spoke theirs, and that really threw him for a loop. Even though he looked different, they left him alone because he sounded the same. And he states how his mixed, but raised by a black family, left him never being able to understand why he was treated differently, other than just being Trevor. Which is something that I think is ubiquitous with us growing up as adults, or as adults tell us that there's a game to play, but don't really tell us what the game's rules or what game it really is. Children are told to do, are told what to do, but are simultaneously told that they need to decide this duality of growing up, and eventually comes to a head when we have to make a choice. For me, this choice is still hard to discern. When did I decide what I identified with and why? There have been many formative events, but it's so hard to decide which one was really the tipping point. And like for you guys, do you have a single moment who solidified who you are now, or do you think it's like a series of choices that coalesce into who you are?
I personally think that identity is more like a series of events that produces who we are little by little rather than like one big event. I think there are definitely like big events that do have an impact, but I think more often it's like definitely more than one event where over time you kind of grow and you become not really a different person, but I mean like growth is always a part of somebody's like personality and a part of life.
Yeah, and say I'm of the mind that it's kind of a system of both, right? You have a series of small events that kind of coalesce, but then there's big moments, say like the passing of a family member or the making of a certain friend, or even like a choice to drive or like text and drive that can change us in an instant. And in the case of Trevor Noah, in the end, the reason why Trevor Noah hits identity rhetoric on the head is his versatility. Like the reason why he was able to identify and discern these facts. No one has had the same set of experiences that created them. However, singular or many similar events have been shared by myself and a kid halfway across the planet. We all have something in common, and Trevor Noah in Born a Crime beautifully demonstrates this fact. He grew up in tough times, so have many others. He had good times, so have many others. Trevor knew how to break down these events of his life into a series of moments where he may not have been able to identify with every single thing, but was able to say, "Hey, I remember feeling like this odd man out in school. Hey, I remember doing something at home and I pretended I didn't do it, and it caused absolute chaos in my household." Point being, Trevor Noah used his understanding of the power of words to convey events in his life, not just as his experience, but making us draw a connection to our own, and then being able to emphasize with at least part of his life and kind of understand him further and further as he goes along. Um, and sorry, and making it, yeah, but demonstrated how there were still unifying traits that someone somewhere reading in his book could relate to.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Marvin. Trevor makes his story very relatable, even though not many people in the world can say that they relate to his like specific situation. One person that can somewhat relate to Trevor is Nelson Mandela, who Trevor actually mentions a lot in Born a Crime. And in Mandela's autobiography, he mentions that he was part of the Xhosa tribe, like Trevor and his mother. Mandela also talks a lot about apartheid and the effects it had on the people of South Africa. He recalls early in his biography that a Xhosa hero warned the tribe about apartheid, saying that what he was talking about is the brutal clash between what is indigenous and good and what is foreign and bad. He mentioned that we cannot allow the foreigners who do not care for our culture to take over our nation, which was, I'm essentially talking about like the Dutch and the Europeans coming over and kind of taking over. And then he said that I predict one day the forces of African society will achieve a momentous victory over the interloper. For too long, we have succumbed to the false gods of the white man, but we will emerge and cast off these foreign nations. Trevor brought up Mandela many times in his book and talked about how he remembers the day that Mandela was released from prison and that it marked kind of the end of apartheid. And Mandela tells the story of the fight against apartheid, whereas Trevor kind of tells the story of how it affected the individual, such as like families, children, students, pretty much like the aspects of people's day-to-day lives. And, you know, they both kind of tie together and are very similar in highlighting that apartheid was, you know, essentially the unfair treatment of South Africans by the Europeans who basically just kind of immigrated there and took over the land for themselves without, you know, thinking about the consequences of their actions. Ashley, how do you think Trevor uses his story as an argument, and what do you think he's trying to either inform, convince, or persuade his audience when he's sharing his story?
My big takeaway from this book is the intertwining roles that race and apartheid play in Trevor's life. He uses several personal examples that we've already mentioned to illustrate to the readers how the race of himself and others impacted their lives due to the established apartheid laws. I believe that the main thing, though, that Trevor is trying to convince us or persuade the readers of is that there is an underlying layer of humanity in all of us, regardless of our skin color or our cultural backgrounds or national barriers or languages we speak, and etc. And if we take even a small amount of time to put ourselves into the shoes of others, we will realize that it's virtually impossible to commit crimes against one another. And I really like this quote that he uses to describe multiple different times in his life, where his ability to push through boundaries or connect with others has helped him. And there's this part specifically in the book where Trevor tried to make money off of selling things he'd buy off of other people that they would steal from the luggage at the airport. And the most notable item that I remember he mentioned was a digital camera. And before he decided to sell it, he looked through the camera and he saw that the pictures were all full of like vacation photos of a white family. And he then realizes that these photos are memories that the family can never get back, no matter how much money that they pay. And he's so overcome with guilt that he actually decides to not sell the camera. And following that, there's the quote that says that we live in a world where we don't see the ramifications of what we do to others because we don't live with them. If we could see one another's pain and empathize with one another, it would never be worth it to us to commit the crimes in the first place. And I think that one single quote puts it much better than anything else that I can come up with. And saying that, Elaine, how do you think, or that what Trevor argues for connects with the critical questions or issues related to society or modern life?
For myself, I think Trevor Noah is a really powerful person, and his language in the book is also really powerful. He's strong enough that he can use the most daily language to tell the bullying that he received in South Africa because to apartheid when he was a child. In chapter 9, even though he moved to a community of people of color, he was still bullied by others. For example, the book says some older black boys started taunting him through berries under the tree. and shouted bushy bushmen. Although we now live in a world with freedom and with multiple cultures and multiple skin colors, however, there still definitely be some incidents that make you feel uncomfortable. Although you may not receive such a bad attitude like Trevor Noah, I think this kind of racial discrimination still occurs. When you are in an area where people have completely different skin tone or speaking completely different language, does people tend to be kind to you or talk coldly?
Yeah, for me, I've been like we've traveled quite a bit to like different countries and just different areas of the United States. And more often than not, I've been treated very kindly. I think just by nature, we want to be kind to people, but situations kind of force us into, or I don't know, for many, I feel like it's circumstances that can force us into doing something negative, whether that's systemic, cultural, or societal, whatever reason it may be. But when I, whenever I'm kind of like the odd man out, I mean, we've all had terrible school situations, but like when traveling, foreigners or people who speak different languages, or even if I myself am the foreigner, um, are more often not kind, and I think that speaks to, I think, human nature. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's really common in society that this kind of incident may happen even we now live in a kind community. At the same time, many people still look at their skin tone and the language to choose whether to be friends, whether to join the group and their attitude towards this person. As Trevor said in the book, when he was in Model C school to a large extent, students were still separated by race and skin color. For myself, I'm a Chinese, so when I first come to America, I'm most likely to choose a group with many Chinese students are here. Many people cannot be like Trevor. Like from the book, he says he's like a cultural chameleon. His mentor is humor, and he can drop in, pass out the snacks, tell a few jokes, and move on to the next group. This may also determine Trevor's identity when he grows up, but his identity may be also caused by his family members or it's caused by his growing experiments. Emily, if you were to lead a discussion group about the book, what question would you ask the readers to contemplate and discuss?
One of the questions I would definitely ask is what was your understanding of apartheid before reading the book? And then how did that understanding kind of change or stay the same after reading the book? Trevor also talks a lot about not being able to be seen with his parents out in public because they could have been arrested. So I think it's important to contemplate what impact you think this had on him as a child. You know, somebody who's walking down the street holding his mom's hand, and then all of a sudden she drops his hand and like acts like it's not her kid. You know, like that's got to be pretty crazy for like a child's brain to comprehend. And I mean, speaking of his mom, Patricia, she plays an incredibly important role in the book and in his life. So I think like what are some of the lessons she teaches him or pieces of advice she gives him and how you think they impacted his growth would also be like a great discussion question for the book. Um, and then also, I mean, he speaks multiple languages, which we've mentioned, and I think he talks a lot about the importance of knowing a lot of languages. And I think a good question would be like, what are some of the ways that the ability to speak different languages allows him to view cultures differently and move between them? And then just like a general discussion question of like, would you recommend the book to somebody if they were asking for recommendations? So, I mean, would you guys recommend the book to people if they were like looking for a fun read?
Absolutely. This book was really fun to read.
I mean, it's a fun read, but you actually take away something really important, which is really great. It's like very easily digestible for most people, but you still get something very important out of it. without
Mhm.
reading a very dense or heavy book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Elaine, would you recommend the book to anyone?
Oh yes, I really like this book and it's really fun. And I think this book is really different between other biographies, this kind of book. So I think I will recommend it. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Anyways, that is our presentation. I hope you like the book. Please read it. Like, by all means, it's a really good book. Amazon, you guys know where to get this kind of stuff. So we'll let you guys get back to your days. Thank you for listening to our podcast.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.